So my first slide here, cover slide, Geography of Change, is the title of our concept document, which I'll refer to more than once probably during the presentation. And if you are interested in energy districts after today, this is a really good place to start. As you can see, energy districts are a model that is spreading inclusive, locally owned energy prosperity and climate stewardship in the heartland. In our model, those two things go together, and Steve mentioned this earlier. So a little bit about me first. I am a farm boy. I grew up milking cows, shearing Christmas trees here on the farm in Winneshiek County, Northeast Iowa. I went off to college and graduate school in ecology and in natural resources. So I think of myself as a resource ecologist as much as anything. Went off to the Peace Corps in Guatemala doing resource ecology, sustainable agriculture and forestry, and of course, community development. When I returned in the 90s, I worked actually for a number of years with USDA, Natural Resources Conservation Service, the NRCS. Many of you are probably familiar with NRCS. As a soil conservationist, a district conservationist, and even a resource conservation development coordinator for a brief stint. Before returning back here, that was working elsewhere mostly. And then in 2007, my family and I returned back to the home place here in Winneshiek County, Northeast Iowa. We still manage the farm, my wife and I, along with our off-farm jobs. Mine here in the energy work, and my wife is a certified nurse midwife. 3 daughters, 2 of them have flown the coop. One's in college, one's working, and then our third is in high school. So when we returned here, and my wife was the professional at that time, working at the local medical center, and I was getting increasingly involved in energy. Had been doing so with USDA some, but then increasingly back here in Northeast Iowa, started to work with other local leaders on clean energy, and we moved towards forming an organization, the Winneshiek Energy District, that I'll be talking about today. And then that model has been replicated enough times that now we have an association, the Clean Energy Districts of Iowa. Maybe we'll have one nationally at some point in the future. But here you can see just a simple map of the clean energy districts that are formed in Iowa. This one's slightly out of date already, which is a good thing. Starting to spill over the state lines, as Steve mentioned, and hopefully we'll continue to grow. We'll talk a little bit about that. Also want to mention, though, that of course, as you know, land trusts are in the energy conversation. The energy work that we're doing is certainly part of some of the energy work and community conversations you can be doing. And as we show on your website here, of course, you have some climate change elements already under consideration by the Land Trust Alliance. Including, quote, the build out of large-scale renewable energy facilities. I'm sure this is an area of extensive discussion among many of you. Opportunities to finance conservation through growing carbon markets, likewise. We'll mention that at least briefly here today. And then this is my favorite quote actually from your webpage. The land trust community has a moral obligation to address the climate crisis. We all do, I believe. And we can help mitigate climate change by doing what we've always done, conserving more land and stewarding it effectively. And then I would add these words, and by convening your community. Now I understand that many of you land trusts vary widely in scope and scale and resources. Some will have more resources to play a convening role than others, but this is already happening in some cases. Our host here today, the Jo Daviess Conservation Foundation, as Steve described, has already been convening some of these conversations around community-led clean energy. The Driftless Area Land Conservancy in Southwest Wisconsin. I should note here in Northeast Iowa, we're also part of the Driftless area, so it's not just a Wisconsin thing. But the DALC has also been convening these conversations and actually has a nascent energy district board formed within their greater organization in Iowa County, Wisconsin. And then there's also an energy district formed that's entirely independent now in Vernon County, Wisconsin. So land trusts, as well as community foundations and other local and regional entities, can be great conveners for this conversation. So what are clean energy districts? Briefly, we are non-profit corporations organized at the county level. And this so far is pretty firm. At the county level allows us to be geographically and socioeconomically inclusive. We're not just towns, we're not just rural, we're that inclusive, meet at the border and spread the good work. We lead and implement the locally owned clean energy transition through strategies I'll mention shortly. We're not utilities, so we really work on saving energy, and we work on local ownership and generation of clean energy. We partner with utilities when we can, and sometimes we may be at loggerheads. That's okay. Because we truly believe that the opportunity is huge for local investment, ownership, and prosperity in the clean energy future. And we'll get to discuss that more as we go along. But when we combine these two goals of both climate stewardship and local ownership of clean energy and the prosperity and wealth creation and retention that brings, it's a powerful combination. And that's why we think anybody that convenes these conversations in their communities really has some strong legs upon which to stand. So this county level model that I mentioned does have historical origins. When some might say, and have already said to us, wow, you want a new clean energy organization in every county? That's just a whole lot of bureaucracy and it's too much and we can't do it. Well, you know, we have actually good models of what I refer to here as universal local all over the place. And in many cases, they are the most effective implementers of change. And in our case with energy, we looked back actually to the New Deal, the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, when at the federal level, efforts were really ramping up to help working landowners, farmers across the country, especially in the Dust Bowl area, implement conservation and stewardship practices. And the feds realized really quickly that they couldn't do that without local leadership. And so they came across this idea that we need a structure at every locality, and they settled on the county as the best geography. We need a local structure that can be our partners in the implementation and acceleration of conservation. And so they farmed out model legislation to the states that would authorize the formation of soil and water conservation districts voluntarily. But within 15 years, all states had passed this authorizing legislation, and most counties in the country were covered by soil and water conservation districts. And it was an amazing movement that many are not familiar with. Many of you may be, but many in our country, including many conservationists and environmentalists, don't understand well. But this movement was instrumental in bringing conservation to working landscapes across the country. So they were universal local institutions, those soil and water conservation districts, not unlike many other universal local institutions that we have in most of our communities. Governmental, of course, local government is important, but things like hospitals and libraries, churches, in Iowa, we have county conservation boards. They run the gamut from private to quasi-public to public entities, even beyond, of course, our city and county government. So soil and water conservation districts were and still are locally led, self-governed. They're encouraged federally, as I described before, and authorized by states, but formed locally. They cover pretty much every county in the US. They were very dynamic for many decades, and in many places they still are. We shouldn't just say were. Soil and water conservation districts, I had the opportunity to work with many when I was at USDA and RCS, and many of them are still doing amazingly important work, often swimming upstream against the currents of greater economic sort of agricultural industrialization, but still doing really critical work. And so energy districts, we thought, why not? Why not create a model like that at the county level for energy, for implementing and accelerating that clean energy transition and owning it as much as possible at the local level. We have had federal and state programs, many cases utility programs, that purport to help clean energy happen, but there is no universal local implementer, and that's essentially what we're about. So how do we work? Could talk for an hour, of course, about all the various strategies that you can use to implement clean energy at the local level. We start with technical assistance, boots on the ground. It's an overused cliche maybe, but we really do try to engage with energy users. Now we have to do this through grant funds because we don't yet anyway have public funds flowing through energy districts to accomplish this, but many of you have had an energy audit maybe of your home or a business or a public entity. We do energy auditing that works because too often energy auditing has been done through utility programs or other programs in the past very superficially without much impact. So we try and do that holistic diagnostics and analysis and then work with the customers to actually do the energy efficiency, to do the locally owned solar, have a real significant impact. We build on that then. We don't start just with the preaching the gospel of clean energy through education and public engagement, we do that, but we build that from our technical assistance. We also get involved in advocacy, market transformation. Again, there's a whole lot we could talk about. I should mention that our technical assistance we do in multiple levels. We have a Green Iowa Americorps team that can do what we call a first step for homes. We work with businesses, farms, institutions too, but our Americorps team focuses on homes and does this initial diagnostics and assessment, a direct install where they change out all the light bulbs, install water saving fixtures, faucet aerators, things like that. Can even do a little bit of air sealing. But then we do the more holistic, what I mentioned also, energy planning for especially businesses and farms, where we do a lot more diagnostics, a lot more economic analysis to help the customer understand what the opportunities are, what should be prioritized, how to go about those savings. And these savings in the thousands of dollars per year in energy for small businesses even, and much larger savings than that for things like nursing homes and hospitals and colleges are normal. This is an opportunity everywhere. Another opportunity, of course, besides in the energy efficiency arena is solar. We could talk all day about locally owned solar. It's a good deal. And also here, technical assistance matters. When we can do site assessments and we're a trusted third party, local, not a utility, not just a contractor, businesses, farms, homeowners, it doesn't take all that much to run the numbers and say, yeah, here's how it comes out, or here are the challenges you face. And it works. We've created a solar market here in Northeast Iowa that is very strong and rolling. And once that happens, the banks get involved. Of course, the contractors are involved. Our role actually has become a little bit less over time, though we're still pretty key players in driving that flywheel of momentum. So beyond strategies, I'm going to touch on a couple other subjects here, including climate stewardship paradigm. There are many models. Many of you may have been reading plans, national plans. There's a lot of talk in Washington these days, of course, about how do we get there? How do we get to climate stewardship and net zero emissions? One of the basic ideas included in most of those plans and models is to increasingly electrify the economy. So right now, what that means is elements of the economy that could be electrified with current technology and coming along technology include transportation, of course, electric vehicles, and include buildings, the portion that are not electric, largely heat. So of course, buildings are mostly heated. Our businesses, our homes, our institutions, mostly these days from natural gas or propane or fuel oil. Increasingly, the heat pumps and related technologies are functional and economically viable. If we can increasingly electrify the economy and then we can decarbonize the grid, we can move pretty quickly towards greening the economy as a whole and lowering the emissions. Now, what this should read is electrify everything because we can decarbonize electricity. If we didn't have the affordable large-scale renewable energy technologies, wind and solar, and increasingly storage and other aspects, then we might be looking at moving more of the economy's energy towards other things than electricity. But it turns out that we can decarbonize the grid quite quickly. So we add to this paradigm that in the process of electrifying the economy, in the process of the clean energy transition, we really need to work on fairness and justice. And we do that not only, but to a large degree through local ownership of both the process and the outcomes. So the process is us, the energy districts, and everyone else involved in the clean energy transition that should bring economic activity and jobs and wealth creation and retention to all of our communities and counties, not just some. Every county and community has this opportunity. And then the more of this clean energy that we own, both in megawatts, the savings through efficiency, and in distributed renewables, the stronger our economies will be and more resilient going forward. So I'm going to touch upon a couple more topics here that energy districts have worked on, but of course are broader than just our work and definitely include land trusts, solar at various scales, and then of course carbon farming. So sunshine farming and carbon farming here. Solar at all scales is critical. We really believe that. We are promoters of locally owned distributed solar, as I've discussed, but utility scale solar is also critical because we need to transition at such a rapid pace our entire energy sector. So sunshine farming has been the topic of quite some angst, increasingly in many of our states and nationally, by many who say we don't have the land. We cannot use our productive lands or our environmentally sensitive lands for energy when we should be using them for food if they're working lands, or for biological benefits and ecological benefits if they're sensitive lands. And I would like to debunk that myth. Not that there's no truth in it, but honestly, let's look, for example, at solar in Iowa. It's just starting to scale up, okay? We have 10 to 11 gigawatts of wind. We have less than a gigawatt of solar by far, but we have many gigawatts in the pipeline in the planning stages, and it's creating some conversation. So let's back up and look at what it would look like to have large-scale solar in Iowa. We have about 27 million acres of cropland in the state, most of our state. In any given year, about half of that, or about 13 million acres, is corn, our largest crop, obviously. And these days, certainly in recent years now, better than half of our corn crop goes into the ethanol plants. Now, yes, there are byproducts that are used in the livestock industry, but the bulk of that product goes to produce energy crops to fuel our vehicles in this case. It's not producing food. So we're using 8 million acres to farm the sun for energy already. All right, so let's look at solar. If we use a conservative estimate of about 8 acres per megawatt of installed solar panels, then 1% of Iowa's ethanol corn acreage. So that's just 1% of just the acres we use for corn that goes into our cars and trucks. About 80,000 acres would generate as much electricity of all of Iowa's current wind production combined, so over 10 gigawatts. And given that Iowa already has, on an annual average basis, more than half of our electricity use coming from renewable sources, which is largely wind, this would bring us well over 100% of clean power in Iowa. Again, that's 1% of our ethanol corn acres, or about 1/3% of all of our cropland. We already use over 1/3, over 30% of our cropland for energy, but 1/3% of our cropland could produce as much sun power, solar power, as we have wind power. So the acreage, yes, it would be tens of thousands of acres, and it probably will be. And that will shock some people because we aren't used to seeing that. But on the other hand, as an ecologist, I have never really appreciated seeing thousands of acres, tens of thousands, millions of acres of corn as a monoculture either. It's not a healthy way to manage our landscapes. So just one last note here about sunshine farming and energy. The energy we get per acre from solar panels can fuel about 10 times the miles driven in a vehicle as the ethanol produced on that same acre of corn. Now, this is not, I don't mean this as an anti-biofuels argument, just as another part of the argument that says, yes, we can. We can produce solar at large scales and power our economy with it and still have plenty of land left over for food, and especially, ideally, hopefully, for much more natural areas and stewardship acreage. So that's sunshine farming. What about carbon farming? Briefly, and we could probably talk all day on this, but yes, money will be made in carbon farming. As a soil conservationist, as an ecologist, I've studied soils quite a bit. There is a large potential for soil sequestration in our croplands, as well as forest lands, and in all lands. But there are a couple big time challenges. One is the value currently of carbon on carbon markets is just not so high that the annual potential for sequestration and accumulation is really enough to incentivize. So that's not saying that there won't be a lot of money going into farmers' pockets and landowners' pockets, not all of them are farmers, for soil farming practices, and that hopefully will be good for the landscape. If we do universal no-till, if we do no-tillage and cover crops and rotations on a much larger scale than we're doing now, that'll be a good thing. But it won't, the carbon money alone won't be enough. And we can talk more about the actual dollars involved if we need to. But the other big challenge, of course, is permanence. Many of you are probably aware of this challenge. We've had soil sequestration programs for 40 years in this country, right? Many of you know them as CRP, Conservation Reserve Program, and other land set aside programs. So land goes into permanent cover for 10 years, and when it comes out and it's plowed up and put back into corn, 70 to 80% of that carbon that was sequestered over those 10 years, poof, it's oxidized and back up in the atmosphere. So how do we have permanence in soil carbon in ag land? It's a real challenge to have those long-term contracts or some form of clawback. On the other hand, land trusts, this is where you definitely have an advantage because you understand permanence. And whether it's working lands or permanently set aside natural areas, you can do this. So there's some real opportunity for sure. So in closing here, just a couple quick slides on the impacts. This is just an example slide for Winneshiek County alone, this one rural Northeast Iowa county where I live. We've served hundreds of farms and businesses, well over 1,000 households. The money is very significant. We have seen well over $20 million invested in energy efficiency and locally owned solar in this county, with $35 million at least worth of energy savings and production. So that's that much infusion. And honestly, this is really just the tip of the iceberg. The amount of solar we've installed and energy efficiency we've accomplished, we feel like we could do 10x that much in coming years, especially if we can acquire some additional resources. So the opportunity, we believe, is there for energy districts, clean energy districts, this model to spread to other states, maybe nationally. That will almost certainly take some state and federal partnership, like that history of soil and water conservation districts that we discussed. Obviously, there's a whole lot of churning conversation happening in Washington these days. What will come out of that, and will we be able to do this? We're unsure. But if those resources materialize, and even if they don't, in many cases, we think that you in the land trust arena would be great partners and great conveners. So a few resources just to close here. These first two are just our website resources. Again, take a look at Geography of Change if you're interested in this model. Jolene Jansen is one of my colleagues in the Clean Energy Districts of Iowa. She's our lead coach, actually, for new counties, starting the conversation. And then, of course, my email is up here.